Good afternoon from the sunny yet chilly Midrand Joburg day in Johannesburg. My name is Odai Humungwe, and a very warm welcome to you all to our groundwater talk on groundwater development, presented to you by the Young Professionals Committee 2021. I'd now like to confirm our agenda for the program this afternoon. Nothing has changed on the agenda. We have all three speakers with us online, and the program is set for this afternoon. Our host this afternoon is no other than the National Vice President of World Merit South Africa. She's a Groundwater Division Young Professionals Committee member. She's a scientist, and she's an all-round philanthropist. Help me welcome Awoda Magingi to the stage. Awoda, the stage is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Odai. Good afternoon, everyone. And if you have joined us from a different time zone, I'd like to just say hello. And again, welcome to this groundwater talk. Just a few things. Please kindly mute yourself so that we do not disturb the speakers, right? So we're going to have 3 speakers, and each speaker is going to talk for about 10 minutes or less, and we're going to take questions after each speaker. So please do not unmute yourself and ask a question, rather pose a question on the chat box, right? So I'm going to read out the questions after each presentation, and the speaker can address or take those questions. And if we have enough time at the end of our presentations, like the last speaker, then we can allow the audience to engage with the speakers. That's if we have time. Okay. And yeah, just one thing that I would like to emphasize: put your questions on the chat box, and I am just going to read them out loud to the speakers, and then they can address them. So our first speaker is going to be Colin Gossi. Colin Gossi is actually a hydrogeologist at Geopollution Technologies, which is based in Durban. So he is the regional manager at the KZN division of Geopollution Technologies. He is responsible for planning, directing, and overseeing operations in that unit. He's very passionate about protection of water resources, with an interest in contaminated land, as well as remediation of contaminated groundwater. So he specializes in offering water resource management, land contamination related professions, and other technical services. Okay, Colin, ready when you are. Colin will be talking about the Karoo Basin transboundary aquifer. That is the groundwater management strategy in a semi-arid climate. And the floor is yours, Colin Gossi.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for the introduction. I hope everybody can see my screen. Transboundary aquifer is a complex subject, and it's also political as well. And my interest in this was sparked by, I was doing monitoring for over 5 years for a mining company based in Musina. So I was working along the Limpopo River. And then while we're developing the conceptual site model for this mine, we realized that the management of this also needs to take into account all the activities that were happening even across the border. Because, for example, the Limpopo River is quite small until the Shashi River flows into it, which is in Zimbabwe. And then most of the farmers in that area depend on the Limpopo River. So it's a complex subject, so I won't be able to go through everything. I'll just touch on some key aspects just to get you interested. I know most of you are researchers and academics, so it would be great if I could spark some interest, and then if there could be any a collaboration after this, that would be great as well. So I'm not going to do much of the reading because we are pressed for time. But internationally, we do not have a groundwater transboundary aquifer governance framework that is set in stone. And these would be the competencies of bodies like the UN, the African Union, and then SADC, as well as Interpol. So a lot of you might not know that Interpol actually has an interest in how these resources are managed, and also how they are studied and monitored. And I found that out about 2 years ago, working with Rian Titas. He's actually running a groundwater school. So if you're interested, you can also just Google. You'll find that you'll find his website on Google. So I want to just alluded now that I'm interested in the protection of groundwater resources, and if we develop information that can assist us, and that information should come from all the economic activity that is happening around those areas, because most of these transboundary aquifers are located in semi-arid climates, and there's a lot of stakeholders that are involved, especially with crop farming, and then there's a lot of conservation taking place around those areas. And we, in terms of funding of this, would rely on such, for example, the mining companies that are mining in the Tule Basin. It's a coal-bearing formation that was deposited into that basin. So we would rely on such companies to be able to provide us with the information that we need, because everything unfortunately needs funding. And then if we can have an information sharing agreement between all the stakeholders, like you would have, for example, mining companies will share information with the surrounding community, and that information, if it can be developed into knowledge that can be passed on with understanding, and then the management of this can take place with some form of information to back it. Now, I'm just going to have a look at the Tule Basin. It's located in Botswana, South Africa, and Zimbabwe. Like I already said, now it is coal bearing, so there's a lot of mining operations actually on either side. So on the Botswana side, on the Zimbabwe side, and the South African side. Where I was actually working, there was an information sharing agreement between the mine across from Zimbabwe with the South African mine, but it faded away. I think it was due to budget constraints, or people started being conservative with the information. And then we are looking at it's Karoo Super Group rocks that were deposited into a fault-controlled basin. So there's a lot of opportunity for groundwater development there because of all the faulting that took place there. And it's an area dominated by large-scale agriculture as well as nature conservation. So there's a lot of stakeholders that are involved locally and regionally. So regionally, I'm talking about the cross-border areas, including Botswana and Zimbabwe. This is just a map to show where this is located in relation to other basins that are of economic importance in the area. But the area that we're interested in, if you can see my cursor, it's that area there on the border of South Africa with Zimbabwe and Botswana. It is actually a large mining operation taking place on the Botswana side, but we've never worked with those guys. And then on the South African side, there's a lot of agricultural activity there, especially because there are farmers that plant winter crops as well as summer crops. So there's a high demand for water. So eventually, at some points, the Limpopo River, before the Shashi River joins it, and before it gets to Bait Bridge. I think at Bait Bridge, it flows permanently, but on the upper sides, on the upper stream sides, it doesn't always flow permanently. So what happens is during the winter months, the farmers will trench the river to try and tap into that base flow contribution of the Limpopo River. So yeah, we cannot separate these two systems, the surface water and the groundwater systems. Was my professor at Wits used to like saying that the groundwater component of the hydrological cycle is actually bigger than the fresh surface water component. So the bigger part control should be more important than the smaller part, but I think it should be managed with understanding of both the hydrological processes as well as the hydrogeological processes. And that's why I had the talk, just to get you interested. And then these are the winter crops I was talking about, and you see the heap of gypsum, and that speaks to the gypsum is applied to try and improve the hydraulic conductivities of the soil for water retention. So that also has an effect on the groundwater quality in this area. And then, so everybody's familiar with these concepts in groundwater, and this is the information that we'd like to get in order to be able to characterize and develop conceptual models for these aquifers. Something like this, and this would help in the management of these areas greatly. And this kind of information as well can help the stakeholders such as the agricultural holdings in these areas, as well as the conservation efforts. For example, on this graph, the change that you see in 2012 is actually related to a flooding event. So that flooding event took place across the entire basin, Limpopo River Basin. So it's important to understand what happened on the Zimbabwean side, what happened on the South African side, as well as the upper stream side on the Botswana side. And then there's a lot of effort that has been put into this to share information. And then for my presentation, I've put on a link to the SADC Water Causes Basin portal. And there are the portals from the UN that you can find online. And then I think my time is up. So thanks. Yeah, I'll be taking any questions if there are any.
Thank you very much, Colin. Like I mentioned earlier, please post your questions on the chat box. And I've just checked now. So in the absence of questions in the chat box, I'd like to just ask you, Colin, in terms of the project that you're working on or that you've worked on in the transboundary aquifers, what sort of challenges that you have encountered, especially because you are dealing with 3 countries in this project, and they have different legislation and institutional arrangements. So what sort of challenges have you encountered, and how did you actually overcome them?
Yeah, so the major challenges, especially because there are so many stakeholders. So you've got farmers, you've got where we're working. We are 5 kilometers from the Mapungubwe Nature Reserve. So, and then all of these people, they want to know what the quality of the surface water is, what the quality of the groundwater is, because they rely on it. And there's a lot of large-scale farming in the area as well. So it's especially for citrus fruit. And you know, the South African industry for citrus fruit is huge. So we need to be able to support all of these with the little information that we have from monitoring around mining sites. So if there was an information sharing effort, even the farmers, they do have boreholes, if we can get the information from that. And then one thing that led me to being interested in this was a farmer during a stakeholder meeting asked me if what about the mine on the Zimbabwean side? What are they contributing to the quality of the Limpopo River? And then we had an information sharing agreement developed, but it faded away, and I'm not sure why. So that was one of the challenges, just sharing information so that we can develop proper hydrogeological conceptual models that can help us develop these frameworks for management.
Okay, I think you've actually touched on one of the questions on the chat box. So just for everyone in this Zoom session, please post the questions and post it to everyone so that I can see from both devices. So the question is, how important is information sharing in transboundary aquifers? So I think you've actually touched on that, unless you'd like to just add on.
Yeah, I think in the interest of time, yeah. So I think I'll put up my email address on the chat as well. So if there's anybody interested, they can email me. With Vets University, we are looking at working on this, developing some research capabilities with regards to this. My supervisor at Vets actually worked on the transboundary aquifer between Sudan and Egypt. I think it's about 20 something years ago. So he'd like to carry on that work. So we are looking for those opportunities. Thanks.
All right, thank you very much, Colin. I think one thing that I didn't mention about Colin has master's degree in hydrogeology. I think that's very important to mention because all our speakers actually have master's degrees. So yeah, thank you very much, Colin, for that. Like I mentioned earlier, if we have enough time at the end of this session, you can still engage with the speakers. Our next speaker is Danita Honey. She is a technician from the Department of Water and Sanitation. I think that's one thing that Odai didn't mention about me. I'm a production scientist at the Department of Water and Sanitation as well. So that's why you see my face, I'm really excited that she's going to give us this presentation. So Danita also holds a master's degree in geochemistry, which focused on the Karoo groundwater and hydraulic fracturing. She has been doing monitoring and management of groundwater in the towns in the Western Karoo. And she started working for the Department of Water and Sanitation in 2009. So since then, she's been doing this kind of work. So already you can tell that she knows a lot about this. So her research focused on the Karoo, like I mentioned, and she will be presenting on groundwater development in the Western Karoo during periods of drought, focusing on Sutherland as a case study. The floor is yours, Danita.
Afternoon, everybody. I hope you can see this. There we go. Okay, so yeah, like what was said, I'm working in the Karoo and we have a lot of issues, and one of the issues is a drought. And this drought have been with us for the past 9 years. And Sutherland is struggling currently to get water to the people. So we have been focusing on this the past few months, and we are trying to look at interventions that could help with the water supply for the future. So just a bit of background, this is basically the area of the Western Karoo, and here you can see on the map, I have also indicated where we get our cold front from and where we get our summer rains from. And for the past decade, the cold fronts don't really go over the whole area anymore, like going to Carnarvon and Victoria West, to go moving east all the way. And the summer rains don't move west all the way, so, and down south. So at the end of the day, we really are struggling with water issues here in this area. Let me just get this pointer on. In this whole area, we have like a huge drought problem. So here is a satellite photo of the recent snowfall that occurred in Sutherland about 2 weeks ago. And as you can see, the rainfall only and the snowfall only moves over the plateau, but it doesn't move towards Sutherland and the rain, the Sutherland. And now we don't get rainfall and snowfall, and we don't get any recharge that is taking place in this town. Therefore, we are sitting with the drought, as mentioned. In the next slide, this is the location of Sutherland, and the town is situated in the southwestern Karoo. The town's water was always being supplied by 4 boreholes, and the boreholes were drilled to around 120 meters. But borehole 4 collapsed to about 44 meters. So this gives us an indication that the town was being supplied by 2 aquifers, a shallow and a deep aquifer. And looking at the current monitoring data and the state of the whole water delivery system, we basically can say that the shallow aquifer have been mostly depleted, while the deeper aquifer is still providing water for us to the town. And then, like I've been indicating, the Karoo is suffering from a severe drought. And this can be seen when we compare rainfall data from the South African Weather Service from the past 9 years to the monitoring data that I've been collected over the years in Sutherland. So we can see the rainfall is declining, and so as well as the water levels in Sutherland. In 2016, we had a once-off recharge event, and we can see that we had an increase in water levels again. So this is a very good news for us, because if I don't think if it wasn't for this rainfall event, we would have been in the dire strait we are in now since 2019 already. Now, in 2019, Borehole 2 did run dry, and the municipality was then requested to send us weekly data of the 3 remaining boreholes. So Borehole 2 was moved a few meters and re-drilled in February 2021. And we can be very thankful for that, because at the end of May, Borehole 4 basically also struggled to start with supplying of water, and we switched it off. And luckily we had the backup of Borehole 2, so we started to pump it again. And I've been working in the town for the past week, and I've been helping the municipality with pumping hours and the water level capturing to see how the water level is dropping and recovering. There you can see we did our test. I'm glad to say from last week till now, we actually got pump 4 pumping again. But yeah, you know how it goes. We thought, okay, yes, we're gonna go and we're gonna say we have 4 boreholes up and running again. And then on Monday, the water levels started to decline again in borehole 4. So we're now back to switching it on every second day. And at this stage, we are also able to switch on borehole 2 and borehole 1, respectively, every other second day to give the boreholes a chance to recharge. So then looking at how we can manage a drought, it is through interventions. And we basically managed to get 3 headlines. It will be the source, the municipality, and the awareness the municipality and the community can partake in when we have people coming in, tourists, etc., etc. So I just want to make a referral to peak population period. This may sound very strange, but Sutherland is, at the end of the day, a tourist town, and especially during winter periods, they get more people in visiting the town. But for the last year, there have been construction of 5 wind farms around Sutherland, and the population now have increased, and so as the water use. Economically, it's fantastic for Sutherland, but a very fine balance needs to be found between how much water is available and how many people it can serve. And this is something we need to take into account for the next year or 2 years when solar farms and wind farms are being constructed in the Northern Cape. And how are we going to balance this reserve of water we have? And if it doesn't rain, are we allowing more people to come in, or what is going to happen? So this is going to be needed to look at extensively. And then, do the interventions work? So what you can see here is we had the water restrictions put in place when Borehole Falls struggled to provide water. And we now basically give 5 hours of water per day for the town. And on that stage, at the end of May, we only had water in Borehole 1, basically till the 18th of June. Since then, with all the interventions that we did do, the day zero was moved to around 6th August. Now, I know that's next week, but I do feel with the new interventions and all the work I did last week in Sutherland, that hopefully after all the monitoring this week, we might have moved day zero again a bit further. And then Borehole 3, I didn't mention it on the previous slide, but as you can see, we basically almost ran Borehole 3 dry. And if it wasn't for the interventions, we would have lost Borehole 3 as well. So now we are slowly recovering Borehole 3, and it's still very critical, but it's a very positive sign, I would say. So to end off, I would like to say thank you to the personnel of the municipality. It's not an easy job to get up every morning, 4 o'clock, to open and close the water lines and to open and shut the boreholes and take water readings and provide it to us on a twice, not even a daily basis. They send sometimes data to us twice a day. We interpret the data and we give out new pumping rates for the next day and how long the hours must pump to provide water to the town. I also need to give a great thanks to Dr. De Lange and his team at IGS, who has also been assisting us since 2019 with a lot of help. And then also to head office and Farnes and his team, Awatwa. You guys have been helping me a great deal, and new eyes on the problem. Yeah, I can say it gives me hope. So thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Danita. And I see we have questions on the chat box for you, Danita. So Angela is asking if the municipality is considering additional groundwater exploration sites.
Yes, we have been, it's been a bit of a struggle, but we are at the moment at a point where we can say we did get money moved to Sutherland. So with this money, we're probably going to see if we can drill about 5 to 8 new boreholes to help with the water supply, because as you can see, the boreholes have been nearly depleted, and with no recharge and rainfall, it is very important that we look for new resources, but also look forward to say, what will happen if we don't get rain for the next 50 years. I know it sounds extreme, but in some cases it is already 12 years for me that I don't get any recharge. So we are at that point where we say we need to think bigger and for longer periods so that we can make sure we have sufficient water supply.
Okay, we still have some time, so I will take the questions on the chat box. Odai is asking, is the deep water levels seen in Sutherland, that is the 50 to 80 meters below ground, related to the little recharge or the geology?
Oh gosh, that's a good question. I would rather say probably the geology, because it is fractured rocks, and your shallow waters, what we previously, when if you looked at my monitoring data, you would see that Borehole 2 always, the water level was always between 24 and 59 meters. And then it dropped to around 50 meters and then it ran dry. So I would say definitely geology, because even now we did get some snowfall and a little bit of rain, I think like 2 millimeters and 3 millimeters at the time. The only borehole that did recharge was Borehole 4, that was shallow. So the rest of the boreholes, I would say, is geology, yeah, restricted to the geology, the recharge. Sorry.
All right. One last question maybe, and then if we have more questions, we can take them if we have more time at the end. It looks like the boreholes are found in different aquifers. Is it possible to tap the aquifer of Borehole 2 in order to tap that aquifer for additional water? And please combine this with my question. I saw that Borehole 2, actually, there's a decrease in Borehole 2, and no, there's an increase in Borehole 2, and there's a decrease in Borehole 4. Do you know what might have caused that? Because I saw like there was a decline in Borehole 4, and there was also like an increase at the same time in Borehole 2. If you understand.
I think at the end of the day, the decline was that previously there's a dam near Borehole 4. So what I think what happens there is if the dam is depleted, there's no water coming in. So it's almost like a AR system. And the moment the dam is full, the water is flowing better. So we can then start pumping again. And that's now currently the situation. That is why the water level decreased and increased. And now we think we put too much strain on the aquifer. So that's why we're now only going to pump every other second day or something like that. We are still struggling to figure out what we are doing. Not what we are doing, but to get a set rule to say, this borehole can be pumped Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays for this hours. Because you also get stuff like the pumps close down and then it stops pumping. Then you need to rush to another borehole to get more water for the day to provide enough water for the 5 hours. And then for Borehole 2, it increases, and I think the only reason why it increases is because we set the restrictions there and we pump every other day. So it's all about the operating rules at the end of the day and how you manage it, I would say.
All right, thank you very much, Danita. I see we actually have a number of questions coming in, but we'll address them at a later stage. So we moved to our third and last speaker of the day, Kes Murray. Kes is a senior hydrogeologist at GEOS, which is in Western Cape, Cape Town. He holds a master's degree as well in geohydrology from the University of the Free State, and he specializes in test pumping data analysis and also has experience in groundwater exploration, development, and groundwater management. Kes will be talking about the transition from being a student to a professional, but relating that to groundwater development and he refers to it as what they didn't teach you at uni. I guess the more experienced professionals, they learned a new word today. Uni refers to university. Over to you, Kes.
Thank you, Awodwa. Yeah, I'm going to try and bridge that gap a little bit. It's not an easy gap to bridge, but I just want to check that I can get my screen sharing going over here. Okay, I think that's all good. And start, there we go. Okay, so the first concept that I'd like to introduce everyone to, and by the way, this talk is very much aimed at other young professionals like myself. I know there's a couple of experienced people in the chat. I looked through the names earlier, and I think a few of them can do with the refresher course as well anyway. So this is a graph of the Dunning-Kruger effect. And this is something that we should be very comfortable with as young professionals coming out of university. You'll see on the y-axis over there is confidence from low to high, and this can be in any subject matter, but for the purpose of this talk, it will be in hydrogeology in general and groundwater development. And you'll see on the x-axis there is competence. And the interesting thing about this graph is that at the beginning, it's quite easy to be very, very confident and not that competent. And this is something that we need a little bit of humility with as young groundwater professionals, because this peak of Mount Stupid at the beginning is where we can often fall short when we're straight out of university. And that leads us to the valley of despair, where we find out that we actually didn't understand anything as well as we thought. And hopefully, as we go on in our careers, we then get to our slope of enlightenment and plateau of sustainability. But really, when we are being confident in our assessments, there's two places that we can be, and it can be quite tempting to think that we are at the high competence end of the scale. And in reality, once we've just left university, it's more likely that we're sitting over here. So how we overcome this and make sure that we don't fall into too many pitfalls as we're starting out in our career is to rely on some of the standards and guidelines that are in our country. So the South African Bureau of Standards has published many guidelines on a wide variety of different topics. And the two that I'd like particularly young groundwater professionals to start looking at and becoming familiar with is the SANS 10299 guidelines, as well as the SANS 241, which is for drinking water. And particularly that first one, the SANS 10299 guidelines, cover, there's published guidelines of this for in our country on how to locate and site boreholes, how to design and drill boreholes correctly, how to correctly test pump boreholes, that's a big issue. And then into the phase of where we start designing how the production is going to be done in those boreholes with the pump sizes correctly sized, and then really discussing that with the engineers as they start putting in all the additional equipment. And this continues on rehabilitation of boreholes where things have gone wrong, and particularly, as Danita was talking about earlier, which was fantastic, is the management of water boreholes, and in a sense also the management of the aquifer at a larger scale as well. So there are national guidelines on how to do this, and it's not the case that once we're out of university, because we've been taught some scientific principles, we will just magically be able to get all of this stuff correct the first time we try it. So please be aware there are some set guidelines on how to do this. And so when we talk about groundwater development as a whole, there's really multiple phases that go into these type of projects. It's not just a pretty picture of water coming out the ground when the driller's on site and he turns the compressor off for 2 hours and then blows the water out the ground for 1 minute. That isn't what groundwater development's about. It's about a scientific methodology and approach to choosing responsible drill targets. And I'll talk briefly about how irresponsible groundwater development and groundwater exploration can occur, and then correctly drilling the boreholes, testing the boreholes for the correct yield and quality and making recommendations on how to use them. And then there's a whole other suite of aspects that don't get talked about that much. And I think the Department of Water and Sanitation would be pleased that I mentioned this over here. There's actual legal requirements in terms of registering a water use and using a groundwater resource, whether that's a private use or agricultural use or an industrial use or anything like that. And ultimately, we do need to monitor and manage these systems. As we've seen, things can change over this time span of 2 years to 10 years to 50 years. And we won't know what we're doing unless we are monitoring, and only with that monitoring data can we actually manage. So a brief sidestep. This is how groundwater is not sustainably developed. As funny as it is to watch water diviners walking around, or people playing golf and hitting the ball into the water and call them a water diviner, this is actually a mismanagement of funds when it's done. And it's not the cost of the diviner that's the mismanagement, it's the irresponsible costs of developing a resource which has not been scientifically assessed. And in some cases, this can be a water diviner knowing that they drill a new borehole in the middle of a larger well field which is already in production, and therefore putting additional strain on the same resource which is already there. It can be the setting up of irrigation programs and plans and infrastructure based on the assessments of this borehole made by a water diviner. So I've provided a couple of links over here. There's 2 fun YouTube videos, and then for the more scientifically rigorous minded people, there's a couple of papers and publications to go take a look at. I'm going to briefly look at one graph from one of those publications. This was a large scale test done on water diviners, not the normal type of groundwater test that I'm involved in, but a test of water diviners, or dowsers as they're called here. It was 500 water diviners in this test, and it comprised of around 10,000 tests. And these results shown over here are the creme de la creme of the results. So the top left graph over there is the best results from the 3 best water diviners out of 500 water diviners. And you'll see on the axis there's pipe location. And so what the test was a pipe hidden under the ground with water put through it, and the water diviners had to locate the pipe. And if the pipe was at 50 meters along the path, and they said 50 meters, then that point would plot along the diagonal line, which is a 1-to-1 fit. If the pipe was located at 20 meters and the water diviner thought it was at 90 meters, that would plot off that line. And so the top left graph is the best results of the 3 best diviners. The top right graph is all the results of the 3 best diviners. And then the bottom 3 are each of the 3 best diviners. Now remember, this is the 3 best out of 500. This is more than the top 1%. And what we can see is an absolute splatter of data over here, as one would expect when someone is randomly guessing in the field. There's people thinking that the pipe is 20 meters along the path, when in fact it was actually 90 meters along the path, and everything in between. Another way that we can mismanage our funds when we're developing a groundwater resource is to incorrectly test a borehole. And I'm not going to go too much into the details of this, but this is an example of a poorly done borehole test. And this is sometimes called a boeretoets or a farmer test or a pump inlet test. And occasionally it's incorrectly called a constant head test. But it isn't that, because it's not correctly performed to do that. And this is an example of one. And the key items that I've highlighted here is the starting water level, which will become important in a moment, which was 34 meters below surface. And then the test was conducted and a rate of 7.5 liters per second was recommended. And now the client equipped the borehole. They started abstracting groundwater at that recommended rate from this borehole test. And a couple of years later, we go to site and the resting water level is now 34 meters below what it had originally been. It's now at 68 meters. So this has been an absolute over-abstraction from this borehole within a few years, a 34-meter drop in resting water level, not pumping water level. So much so that when we try to do a pump test on it, at half what the recommended rate was from the previous test recommended 7.5 liters per second. We tried to pump it at 3.2 liters per second, and it couldn't even last 7 hours. So this is the type of thing that I'm talking about with a wasteful expenditure or mismanagement of funds. It's not the cost of the test that's the mismanagement, it's the resultant costs that come later on from the infrastructure put in for that testing. Okay. Oh, if you have over-abstracted an aquifer or an area, there are ways to address that. Managed aquifer recharge is something that's growing a lot in our country and the world in general. And what you can do is actually infiltrate or inject groundwater or excess surplus water back into the ground to replenish those depleted volumes. Obviously, you require some surplus water to do that, which is why it hasn't been done at Sutherland, which is an unfortunate situation over there. Okay, I'm going to briefly run through this conceptually, just to look at how groundwater development occurs in general, not at a specific site. Generally, groundwater is sourced from rainfall. So if we have high rainfall, there's more of a chance of that replenishing groundwater than if there isn't, and it's hosted and transported in the underlying geology. So if we have the rainfall and the geology of an area, we have a fairly good idea of what the aquifer in the area is doing. And then our job as hydrogeologists, if we're developing a new resource, is to look for areas within that geology where the transport and storage of groundwater is higher than normal. And this usually relates to structural features or the size and sorting of grains in a sedimentary environment. Then we go to the field and try to find these features and identify them in the field. Look for the structural deformations, go look at what other boreholes in the area can tell us about the aquifer in general, and perhaps do some geophysics to help us characterize what those structural features are doing below the surface. Once we've done that, we collate that data into GIS, so we can look at it spatially and have a better bird's eye view and understanding of what's going on. And then if we're lucky, when we do drilling, we get some results of water being intersected. It's important to remember, though, that as a professional, our job isn't to be the driller, our job is to supervise the driller, and that includes checking to make sure that they get on site on time, making sure that they position their drill rig correctly at the site of the spot, checking their materials, making sure that they're welding things correctly, taking good geological information, which helps us understand the resource and manage it better in the future, identifying where the water strikes were and any characteristics about them, and if there are water strikes, taking a yield measurement so that we can see how that rate of flow increases at the different water strikes. The same goes for test pumping. The contractor will come to site, perform a pump test on the borehole. Our job is to make sure that the measurements that they are taking, which we will later rely on, are accurate measurements of drawdown, accurate measurements of the flow rate during the testing, and making sure that that flow rate stays nice and constant. From that, we can get our step test results. We can do a constant discharge test, take a look at what other boreholes in the area are doing, what their connectivity is to the pumping borehole, and then we can analyze it using the FC method. And I'm not going to go too much into this, but essentially the method uses the first and second derivative of drawdown data in our constant discharge test and extrapolates that into late time, and then scales back a recommended yield based on a point past which we don't want to drop the water levels. Finally, we can get into the monitoring and management. Again, which has been touched on earlier, we can monitor our production boreholes. We can look at what the aquifer around those production boreholes do. Are we depleting a resource? Is there any chance that we're bringing in water quality that's of a poorer quality from a leaky aquifer adjacent to the one that we're abstracting from? And then this data we can use to properly manage our resource and ensure that we don't get too far down the line of over-abstraction, if indeed we are over-abstracting. So the summary of my talk is really this: groundwater is not magic. As students, we have been taught sound scientific principles, and our job as young professionals is to use the standards and guidelines published in our country to achieve sustainable groundwater development that is not going to be over-abstracted or depleted in the future. We will come up against very emotional arguments for traditional methods of doing groundwater development. These are a gross misuse of funds and should not be tolerated. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kes. I think you've also noticed that Kes went over time, but we are trying to stick to time, and I can take a few questions from the audience. And in the absence of questions, I'd like to just ask you, Kes, since you have experience in groundwater exploration, development, and management, how would you differentiate between safe yield and sustainable yield?
So there are quite a few different concepts. Okay. There are quite a few different concepts, sorry about that, that relate to yield of boreholes. There's potential yield, there's a safe yield, sustainable yield. I think some of the other ones are exploitable yield. This goes down to definitions a little bit. There is a published definition as part of the FC method of the sustainable yield of a borehole. And that essentially revolves around not dropping water levels below a defined point within the borehole. So that is a definition that can be used when we're looking at a single borehole. When we start looking at long timeframes, and normally sustainability is about much longer timeframes than a few years, we do need to start looking at recharge. And it's possible to do that through the FC method, but the mathematical definition of the FC method doesn't require us to take recharge into account over there. So if recharge is a limiting factor, then that will not be a suitable definition. So I don't know all the definitions verbatim, but the point of all of them is to assess what the impact of abstracting groundwater is on a borehole or on an aquifer or on a well field, and to ensure that that is repeatable in the future without depletion.
Okay, I think just one last question. And if we have more questions, you are more than welcome to post them on the chat box. We will try to convey them to the speakers, and we will send you the responses. So there's a question on the chat box for you, Kes. Russell is asking, can you explain the impact of drilling through a first aquifer into a second aquifer and the possibility of draining the first aquifer? And maybe if you can also tap into this last question that I'm going to take. How best would you suggest the tertiary institutions to incorporate some of what you have shared with the students? Did you get that, Kes?
Yeah, I got that. Russell, addressing Russell's question, the first question, that the potential for draining the first aquifer into a lower aquifer requires an understanding of the piezometric level of the underlying aquifer. Quite often deeper aquifers, unless depleted, will have been recharged in a higher area, which means that their piezometric level will actually be quite shallow. If it's not shallow, there's definitely a risk of the upper aquifer draining down into the lower one, but quite often we actually have upward leakage because the deeper aquifer will be confined and under pressure, and the reverse effect will actually occur. And that's something that I've seen happening before, where there's low yields in a shallow aquifer, which do not meet the required demand on water supply. And so people decide to drill deeper and intersect a saline pressurized aquifer, which then leaks saline water into the upper shallow aquifer, and can definitely have adverse effects. So that goes back to looking at what the standards are for borehole drilling and ensuring that any borehole that's drilled is done responsibly and correctly to limit any risks of something like that occurring. The second question about tertiary institutes introducing this, I'm going to defer to the groundwater division itself, because I believe they just put out a poll to other professionals. I spent probably a little bit more time than I should have putting an extensive reply in that poll, which I'm sure will be extractable over there. But my opinion on this is that a lot of these things people can be exposed to once they start working, and it's quite easy to say work exposure for students is absolutely the best way to go. I think it's much more important that students are scientifically sound in their thinking, that they have good critical thinking, good observation skills, good data recording skills. But above all of that is an understanding of the principles of the scientific method. That's something that can't be taught, and at the moment it's a little bit too easy to get through everything by just learning a lot of things off by heart. And I mean, everyone knows, as well as your employer or potential employer, there's no point in paying you a professional salary if all you are is a slower version of Google search, which is on the smartphone in their pocket. So you have to be able to think critically, and I think that's the number one thing that students should be trying to develop at university.
Thank you very much, Kes. I think most of people from the audience actually do agree with me when I say This was very informative, and we're actually planning to host more so that we bridge the gap between the young professionals and the older experienced professionals. We learn from them, they learn new techniques from us as well. So thank you very much to our speakers. We have moved from transboundary aquifers to planning for drought, short and long-term plans for drought, as well as what they didn't teach you at university, like the soft skills, you know, these are very important in the industry. So thank you to our speakers, and I will just hand over to Odai to do the closing remarks. And I just noticed now from the chat box, someone asking if this will be available, the recording of this. Yes, definitely it's going to be available. We will share the link to the YouTube channel or to our YouTube, because this has been recorded. Then you can go through it again if you'd like to and ask questions. We will just convey them to our speakers. Thank you very much. Over to you, Odai.
Thank you so much, Awodwa, and a very special thank you to our speakers, as well as to you, our host, Awodwa, as well as to our behind the scenes players, role players, which are the Young Professionals Committee, as well as to you at home online for tuning in. This webinar would not have been possible without your input and participation. Thank you all for tuning in this afternoon, for your time. And if you haven't registered for the conference, the early bird tickets close this Saturday, so do so. We will unpack further groundwater development challenges and new innovation in our conference from the 17th to the 20th of October. So do that. And on behalf of the Young Professionals Committee, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank you all. Thank you. This adjourns our meeting.